In African countries like Sierra Leone or Gambia, where Creole minorities have become the new ruling classes over masses, still mainly black. And that was from the last section that I read in Group Identity and Political Change by Harold R. Isaacs. And I will proceed to read in the next section right now. But first, I hope everyone is doing well. Nubian guys and goddesses, ladies and gentlemen, I am Empress Wahid in the living room. I am listening to Japanese lo-fi playlist. No copyright. He proceeded with the validity of all of these things he's talking about in this section. Valid as it may be, in many instances, the charge of European white responsibility for current racial patterns in the ex-colonies is valid only up to a point. In many places, this point is quickly reached. The white imperialists did raise the value of white over dark, but they rarely created the value in the first place. They exploited antagonisms based on differences of color and kind. They did not originate them. It is convenient to hold the ousted white imperialists responsible for it all, and it is never wholly false to do so, nor is it ever wholly true. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the truth at all. It often tends to be the self-punitive view of white liberalists, overburdened with guilt for the sins of their colonialist fathers, or the self-aggrandizing view of ex-colonial subjects. It is a way of converting the less than human into more than human. The guilty white liberal is only too glad to assign all virtue to the oppressed. The oppressed is usually only too ready to accept this gratuitously offered halo. The Asian or African nationalist was often glad to see himself not only as winning power back from the Europeans, but also as restoring the human spirit to the higher levels from which only European malevolence had cast his people down. Great struggles were waged and sacrifices made in the name of this belief or this pretense. It has been difficult to maintain, however, in what has followed. Both Asian and African nationalism adopted the ideas or at least the rhetoric of European liberal or radical humanism. The freedom won turned out to be something considerably less than freedom in the political sphere. While in the racial sphere, it has often meant, as Frantz Fanon mournfully acknowledged, displacement of European white racism by a non-European non-white racism. This is a matter still too little explored by too many, but there is much to indicate that unmistakable patterns of what we would call racialism, and especially attitudes about skin color, formed part of many of these cultures long before their exposure to the power of the conquering white Europeans. What? Okay, let me go further with this. In Africa, only some of these new outlines are now dimly seen. Two main new patterns of relationship come into view. One appears in Black Africa, itself among the many tribes of people who live south of the Sahara. The other lies between the people of Black Africa and non-Black or Arab Africa north of the Sahara. In Black Africa, people are divided into a multitude of tribes clustered in several large groups, some marked off by language types, some by physical differences. For a long time, the main business of modernization in Africa is going to be bringing these groups into some new kind of coherence based on new political and economic development. This is going to be a complex and formidable undertaking, for tribal divisions exist within each of Black Africa's 35 new nation states and cut across the new national boundaries. The friction can be explosive, as eruptions of conflict have shown in the Congo and Rwanda and Burundi, in Somalia, Kenya, and Uganda. The differences are heavily matters of geography, culture, history, levels of development, and social organization, all coming under the pressure of the new national and international politics. At certain points, tribal differences are also physical, sometimes spectacularly so, as in the case of the tall Hamitic Watusi and the shorter Bantu Bahutu, who engaged in some massively bloody clashes in the late 1963 and 1964, fighting and raiding across the borders of several newly created states. There are differences of color and feature, from brown to black, from Hamitic aquilinity, in which in which the Ethiopians, like the Watusi, take such haughty pride, to Negroid broadness, in which there are also variations. We are still vastly ignorant about the quantity and quality of these differences, and will have to wait to learn more both about their nature and their impact on the new history of emerging Africa as it unfolds. The new relations coming into being between Black Africans south of the Sahara and non-Black Africans north of it are somewhat more visible. Between these, there are at least one strong link and at least one deep chasm. The link is Islam, the religion of northern Africa and of perhaps as much as a third of the black population in the South. The chasm is deeply cleft and no easier to cross than the Sahara. It is the historic memory of Arab, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Arab enslavement of black men, an activity in which Arabs, Berbers, and others of the North were engaged long before they had to begin sharing their profits with the slavers arriving later from Europe. Both of these elements in North-South African relationships have come strikingly into view in the recent new politics of the continent. Nasser's abortive bid to shape and lead a new Pan-Africanism was at least partly based on the appeal to a new and greater Islam, including the claim that Islam's professions of brotherhood among men are more fully practiced than Christianity's. Pan-Africanism itself, in all its mooted shapes, has stumbled upon regional, national, and tribal divisions in the new Africa. Nasser's pretensions in particular have stumbled upon the contrary pretensions of other African leaders. Just how Islamic influence will come to bear in the reshaping of emerging Africa remains to be seen. Meanwhile, the Arab past in Black Africa has been most directly invoked in the process of countering Nasser and of keeping Arab influence in general at desirable distance. Moise Tshombe provided possibly the bluntest example of this after his humiliations in Cairo. Following Nasser's refusal to let him attend a conference of African leaders in October 1964, Tshombe mobilized powerful emotional support from crowds of cheering Congolese in Leopoldville by reminding them that the Arabs had been slavers bef- before and would now become slavers in new form if black men allowed them to be. He staged a show in a stadium in which a band of Egyptians raided a village, beat the women, shot some of the men, and tied the rest to a long rope by which they were led forth. At this point, a Congolese army came dashing in to the rescue, slaying all the Egyptians and freeing the slaves. The real Africa is our Africa, Black Africa, shouted Tshombe to the crowd. We are the Africans of Africa, not the Arabs. The same deeply embedded emotions also surfaced last year in the Sudan. Light-skinned Arab Muslim pro-Egyptian northerners used pitiless force to crash a rebellion of the black, non-Muslim southern Sudanese minority. A report from Khartoum observed that the insurrection, whose root cause is racial, has pitted African against Arab, reviving the deep racial hatreds of the Arab slave trade among the Negro peoples of the southern Sudan a century ago. The late Frantz Fanon, a Martinique black man and French-educated psychoanalyst who joined the Algerian War against the French and became one of its most eloquent tribunes, wrote in 1961 with a certain anguish of the commonest racial feelings he found among Algerians and Arabs, proud of their 1,000-year-old tradition of culture, while Black Africa is looked upon as a region that is inert, brutal, uncivilized, in a word, savage, and black men as a people who are impervious to logic. In what he called white Africa, meaning Arab Africa, he wrote, black men were insulted by being called Negro by children in the streets, while African students suffered various embarrassments at the hands of their Arab hosts. Meanwhile, in many of the new states of Black Africa itself, wrote this passionate black revolutionist, from nationalism we have passed to ultra-nationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism. The new leaders whom he scorned as bourgeois and the new governing parties were in many places falling back toward old tribal attitudes. And furious and sick at heart, we perceive that race feeling in its most exacerbated form is triumphing. The new chapter in the story of racism that is being written in Africa has only just opened. The same newness marks the relationships just beginning between black men, whether African or other, and other non-whites elsewhere in the world. On this score, it now seems somberly reasonable to predict that color will continue to be a more critical factor for the black man than for any other kind. So, we have it. They predict that color will continue to be a more critical factor for the black man than for any other kind. And Frantz Fanon, the late Frantz Fanon, wrote that we have moved from nationalism we have passed to ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism. The next one I'm going to have up is when it's starting to go into peoples in Asia. how they had varying kinds of experience with white domination. I hope that you are enjoying this book as much as I am. I am really looking forward to the next section, which will be the role of color in adaptation phenomena. An outline of the role of color and adaptation phenomena by Francois Revue. So I'm almost at the end of this one. Almost. I didn't know it was going to be this long. So what is everybody thinking about the most current events? I have not been paying too much attention to the latest. It's always something. Then it'll die down. My concern is hearing about Jaheim McMillan, the 15-year-old black man who was gunned down and shot in Gulfport. I think it's Gulfport, Mississippi. He was coming out of a Family Dollar with his hands up, and he was shot 8 times in the head. An eyewitness in the parking lot said that he didn't have a weapon, as well as workers in the Family Dollar said that he didn't have a weapon. I just wanted to say that, because it brought back to my mind about the ending of what I just read about this section. "15 years old. My heart goes out to his family and friends, and to us as Afro-Americans in this country. I will be with you again in this next session. I wish you peace, love, and light. And please stay tuned to Black Living Room Talk for more conversation, information, and stories. Hotel.